can do no wrong.
Do no wrong.
And you can do no wrong.
Do no wrong.
I like it when you stay.
I like it when you go.
I like the way you try my way.
I like it when you won't.
And I'm free by your side. And when I see, baby, you don't hide. And you can do no wrong.
Do no wrong.
And you can do no wrong.
Do no wrong.
You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue. You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue. A whisper of sweetness, let's keep this our secret. Whisper of sweetness, let's keep this our secret.
You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue, baby.
You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue. Yeah. You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue. You can do no wrong with that midnight honey on your tongue. And I like it that way.
Like it that way. Oh yes, I like it that way. Like it that way.
And I like it that way. Like it that way.
Oh yes, I like it this way. Like it this way.
In the bath, Barcelona plays. Eyes closed, flames ablaze. Water drips off of my head. Through my lashes, you appear. In all your arching glory, you stretch yourself before me. In this our endless story, I long for endings only. You slip through my fingers. 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 You're like water in my hand. Water in my hand. You're like water in my hand. En el baño Barcelona cerra los ojos y amasan llamar. Mi cabello goteando agua. Apareces por mis pestañas. En todo tu gloria. Antes de mí te inspiras. En nuestra historia sin fin. Solo deseo los fines. You slip through my fingers. You slip through my fingers, baby. You slip through my fingers. Well, you slip through my fingers. You're like water in my hand. Water in my hand. You're like water in my hand.
caliente and a kiss. Shadows fall across my face. I close my eyes, but it's too late. You slip through my fingers. You slip through my fingers. You slip through my fingers, baby. You slip through my fingers. You're like water in my hand. Water in my hand. You're like water in my hand. Water in my hand. You're like water in my hand. Water in my hand. You're like water. Water She fell to the ground, her soul flew over me. Eyes wide, no sound loud, but the wall screamed.
Visit omsi.edu for more information and resources. And if you do any of the science activities, please send us photos or videos so we can see what a wonderful scientist you are. Putting on these live shows takes a lot of work, and we have an amazing partner that helps us make this happen. So a big thanks and shout out to Celestream for providing the live streaming services for tonight's Science Pub. We really appreciate their support. I also hope that you enjoyed tonight's pre-pub trivia and music by Wild plus Red. Hear them live at the Kendall concert in OMSI's Planetarium. We're currently scheduled to have them on October 4th, and tickets are $15. We are really excited to welcome everyone back into the museum. Oops, yeah, there we go. We have our body rolls in the cycle of life exhibit open to the museum, and you can also tour the USS Blueback submarine. Advance tickets are required, and the health and safety of OMSI guests and staff is our utmost priority. We want you to feel comfortable and safe while discovering at OMSI. To meet state guidelines and help limit the spread of COVID-19, OMSI has implemented some changes throughout the museum. Visit omsi.edu for more information. And you'll probably get to see me if you come to the Body Worlds exhibit too. So there's another motivation for that. Another place you can see my face is our first virtual OMSI After Dark, which is Zest Fest. We're gonna virtually enjoy some delicious spicy foods. We'll have a 2-hour program on Friday, July 24th from 7 to 9 p.m. You can expect to see some science demos, some hot sauce experts, music, fire eaters, live ice carving, and more. Tickets are $50 and includes 6 hot sauces and 4 spicy snacks, enough for 2 or more to taste during the event and then enjoy for the next month. $15 extra if you want to ship it to your home anywhere in the US, or you can pick it up at OMSI the week of the event. Go to omsi.edu/zestfest for more information. And you can also support your local community by putting the pub back in Science Pub and ordering some delicious food and beverage from our partners that are listed here. We've got partners all across the state that you should check out, eat and drink, enjoy yourself. Yeah, so for tonight, what will tonight look like? It'll look like most science pubs look. We're gonna start with art and science themes trivia game that'll be sort of a warm up for tonight's talk. After that, we'll have a 60-minute lecture by Stephanie Storey. And then afterwards, we'll have 30 minutes of question and answer. For the Q&A, you can submit your questions at any point during the lecture via the comments in our live feed. We'll collect them all, and after the lecture, I'll ask everybody's questions to the speaker. If you enjoy tonight's lecture, please consider making a donation or purchasing a Science Pub pint glass, which is pictured here on the screen. What a cute little pint glass. We'll post the links in the comments section for more information on donating or purchasing a pint glass, but don't worry, there's no pressure to donate. Our mission at OMSI is to inspire your curiosity by creating engaging science learning experiences for people of all ages and backgrounds. So please sit back, relax, and get ready for a great lecture right after our trivia. I would like to welcome on with me this week, Hafsa, who is the coordinator for OMSI's Teen Tech Center. Woo! I'm gonna
Hey everyone.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
What are you most excited to hear about with this lecture and like arty, sciencey stuff?
I guess a little bit more of how they use science and art specifically with like linear proportions and like, yeah, that kind of stuff to make it look more realistic.
Yeah. All my drawings, I don't use that stuff at all. It's just like very flat, everything, no 3D. Maybe I'll like up my game tonight. Are you motivated? Do you feel like you're gonna beat this trivia? Do you feel confident?
Basically, yeah, I'm gonna get a 10 out of 10.
Nice. Yeah, this is how we're gonna do it. For everybody at home, you can grab a pencil and paper, or you can just shout the letters out loud. Hafsa, are you gonna shout letters out? You gonna show a letter? What's your game plan?
I'm gonna shout it out.
Yeah. And for everyone playing at home, you can try to make this a little bit interesting by adding some stakes to your trivia. Maybe you can play for bragging rights. Who gets to wear a beautiful crown or tiara for the rest of the week? Maybe who has to do the dishes? Maybe who you have to like bow to them every time you see them if they win the trivia. So come up with some stakes with your fam or your foreign team and get ready to play. I'm going to have 10 multiple choice questions, and how it'll work is I'll read out the question and I'll give y'all time to guess, and then I'll reveal the answer before I move on to the next question. Okay. I think I've asked you this a couple times already, but are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's do this.
Okay. Question number 1. Which of these things did Leonardo da Vinci not design in his notebooks? Scuba gear, a spotlight, a telephone, or a robot?
Wait, how many seconds do I have to answer?
The number that you feel comfortable with. Taken. Yeah, whatever.
Okay.
There's no timer. I'm not like doing Jeopardy music at you.
I feel like, he was a real smart feller, and I want to say a telephone.
You are right.
Oh,
Yeah. So, Da Vinci drew designs for early form of scuba gear. Scuba deer would be cool too, honestly. Because he thought staying underwater for long periods of time would be a good military tactic to sneak up on people. He also made a spotlight for directing candlelight, and a crude robot. He did not come up with the telephone though. So awesome. 1 for 1. You're at 100% so far. Going strong. Let's
keep it there.
Let's maintain that level at all costs. This is a thing where I have not heard of any of these people, so good luck. Who first recorded in writing the rules of linear perspective for painting? Was it Masaccio? I'm guessing on these pronunciations. Masaccio in his notes for his Holy Trinity fresco in 1427. Oh, Da Vinci, I heard of him. In his Codex Arundel in 1508. Was it Leon Battista Alberti in his Da Pictura in 1435, or Filippo Brunelleschi in his treatise on painting in 1421?
Leonardo's the only one I've ever heard of too. Let's go with Filippo, because I can't pronounce his last name either.
The one with the cool last name. Let's see. I can't remember. Oh, another confusing name. So I think you were 75% of the way there.
75% of the way there.
Brunelleschi is often credited. Oh, that's the one you choose. He's often credited with creating the rules of linear perspective. So apparently you were. That was a great guess.
Yeah, just a little bit.
In person, and he didn't write that stuff down. Masaccio was the first to capture the rules of linear perspective in paint in his fresco of the Holy Trinity, and he also didn't write down those rules. But architect and painter Leon Battista Alberti was the first artist to set down these rules in writing for artists for centuries to come to use his treatise on painting to guide their perspective.
Okay. If you want credit, write it down.
Yeah, there's the lesson there. That's a great lesson. Okay, let's try number 3. Hey, this is sort of what you were looking forward to learning more about. Which of these optical elements did Renaissance painters not use to create perspective? Vanishing point, atmospheric perspective, orthogonals, or stippling?
I feel like stippling is like a brushwork technique. Maybe
little dots like.
Yeah. Maybe C is like the answer to like throw us off. I mean, A definitely makes sense. B, that sounds like a weather thing. Atmospheric perspective.
Maybe it's like making the air look different if it's far away.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with B.
With which one?
Oh, with B. B for boy.
B for boy. You're really close.
Ah.
If you had a second choice, what would it be?
Or orthogonals.
Nah, it's that brush pattern.
Oh, it's stippling.
It's just little dots and specks. It's not really.
I was like, that's the one. I'm pretty sure it's not.
Okay, don't worry. We're gonna bring it back. Okay, number 4. Michelangelo engineered an inventive scaffolding to paint the Sistine Ceiling. It worked, but what problem did it create for him and for the chapel? Did the shape of the scaffolding force him to lie on his back to paint for 4 years? Or the shape of the scaffolding forced him to stand on his feet to paint for 4 years? Or he had to drill holes into the existing frescoes on the walls, masterpieces painted by the likes of Botticelli, Ghirlandaio, and Perugino, or the scaffolding sat on the floor of the Sistine, interrupting papal services.
I'm gonna go with A.
Yeah, I have no idea what the answer to this one is, so I can't like give any kind of hints. A sounds right though. I feel like you always see cartoons of him like dripping paint in his eyeballs, right?
Yeah.
Oh, sweet. Oh,
The
just like the long-standing myth.
Oh, it's a myth. Okay.
We're bamboozled by popular opinion. Okay, you ready for the next one?
Let's do it.
Ooh, that's pretty. Many Renaissance pigments were toxic. Which of these pigments did not slowly poison painters over time? Is it railgar, orpiment, vermilion, or carbon black? Think about the one that maybe you know what those words are that are more familiar. Where do we find like carbon, like black carbon kind of stuff?
Charcoal? Oh, is it D?
Do I don't know. Do you think charcoal will like poison you if you touch it?
Probably not. And I don't know what realgar or orpiment are. I feel like vermilion's a kind of red. Maybe is that used creating rust? No.
Vermilion's like the more bright red. It's not the
It's
red,
the more bright red. Okay.
the rusty red.
Let's go with B. A?
You're the hit. It's carbon black. So carbon black is made from heating wood and other plant-based materials, so it's toxic. Apparently, realgar and orpiment are both arsenic sulfides, and vermilion is mercury-based.
Vermilion's mercury. Okay, did not slowly poison. Okay, obviously, of course. Okay.
Everyone, this is great. And we're halfway through. I feel like I learned a lot.
Me too. I'm gonna look up all these paints, like how they're made.
Yeah, and like how many of them killed their painters or made them go crazy.
That too.
Next question. Which ingredient in a traditional fresco mix allows it to bind permanently to the wall? Is it water, lime, sand, or marble dust?
I feel like you need water to mix anything. Is it like in addition to water?
I think all four of these are in the mix, like all four. But which of these four helps it like really bind to the wall?
I'm gonna go with lime. Okay, it has to be B because I chose 3 B's so far and it wasn't any of them.
You know what's funny though is like each time you choose the first answer you choose to just mention has been the right one. I feel like 4 different times in a row you've like mentioned the correct answer, but then you end up choosing B. So what was that first answer you mentioned on this one?
Is it water?
It is water. I think your instinct is like leading you to the right one. Not always starting at the top to talk about it. You're like, correct one. Okay, I'm gonna second guess and go for another one.
Okay, go with my gut feeling.
That's another lesson I'm learning. Yeah, so fresco plaster was traditionally made from mixing water, lime, and sand. But it's the water as it dries that technically soaks up the pigment and allows it to become a permanent part of the wall.
Okay. Water.
Yeah. Okay. Whew. Here's one of a lot of words. We'll get through it. Okay. In 1504, Michelangelo had to move his 17-foot tall, 12,500-pound marble David statue, approximately 600 meters or about 2,000 feet, over unpaved roads from his workshop near the cathedral to its final pedestal in front of City Hall. What kind of machine or process did he use to move this gigantic statue? Was it legions of men passing the statue forward like buckets of water to put out a fire? Look at their legions. Levers and pulleys hanging down from rooftops, a heavy tank-like cart with David bolted to the top, or rolling logs under a platform?
I feel like rolling logs under a platform is a very simple way of doing it.
I feel like that's how they moved the Easter Island folks too, all those statues.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Is that your gut?
That's my gut, but then I kind of want to go with B.
Trust your gut. Trust your gut. You're so right.
Trust my gut more. Okay.
Let's see. David moved from his workshop to his final pedestal. I'm talking about David like he just moved himself. That's cool. It's an engineering task for Michelangelo. He eventually placed David into a swing contraption that would move a little as men transferred logs under a flat platform to roll him down the street. Okay. That was great to see. That would have been a good reason to stop traffic. Okay. Yeah. Home stretch. Last couple questions. How did the goldsmith Brunelleschi construct the high dome of Florence's cathedral without using flying buttresses to shoulder some of the weight? He raised it atop a series of pointed arches. B, built 2 domes, one nested inside of the other. C, used a large centering support during construction that stood on the floor of the nave, interrupting services. Or D, dug new foundation pier trenches 25 feet deep.
I feel like D is oddly specific. It's like 25 feet. So it's either A or C.
I don't know. I can't give any hints on this one. I can't remember what the right one is. Both of A and C is what I would choose, one of those two.
Yeah, and I'm like, So like the way that I answer multiple choice questions is like I think of like the person that was like writing down the answers, like what they would have thought people would choose as an answer and then choose the opposite.
Yeah, getting into the mind of the test creator.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, so far it hasn't been working, but it just might work now. Oh, okay, let's go with C.
I like C. That's what I would choose, honestly. Let's see. Are we correct? Oh,
I said it was A or C.
man. Okay. Wow. 2 domes nest inside the other. So the same construction used to build the dome of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. That's awesome. I don't super understand how that works. I feel like I need to read into that more.
Oh, like maybe like they built the smaller one and then did they unbuild it? Not unbuild it. How do you like take it apart after they were done with the big one?
Maybe we'll learn about it in the lecture. Ooh, that'll be cool. Okay, last couple. What method did artists rely on most to study internal human anatomy during the Renaissance? Did they read anatomy books, like the 7 books on the fabric of the human body by anatomist and surgeon Andreas Vesalius? Did they observe doctors performing surgery on patients? Did they personally dissect corpses, or did they study the drawings of Leonardo da Vinci?
I'm gonna go with C on this one.
Yeah. Look at how creepy this is. I feel like that's gotta be, okay. Yeah!
Because they used to like steal dead bodies or something.
Yeah. Apparently that anatomy book on A wasn't published until 1543. And although Leonardo did make anatomical drawings, they were not published during his lifetime. Some artists watched others perform surgery, but for the most part, they just personally dissected the dead, which Michelangelo and Leonardo did regularly.
Good to know.
Yeah. Okay. Final question. Let's see if your gut can take us to the
gut feeling.
Wow, I like the background behind those statues. Okay. The classical Greek conception of the universe, called kosmos, was the foundation of the Renaissance worldview. What does the idea of cosmos tell us? That the universe is ordered and harmonious. The universe is unpredictable and uncontrollable. Nothing in the universe has an innate purpose, or the order of the universe is like a mechanical system. I like your thinking face.
It's like none of them have anything to do with each other.
I know. I think about like if you look at all those big frescoes and things, like what kind of like which of these answers kind of feels like it guided all those like stuff that was going on in some of those big scale drawings and art creation.
Well, I never got a really harmonious feeling, nor did I get it everything has a purpose or there's like a system. So I'm going to say the universe is unpredictable and uncontrollable.
I feel like this is just how we feel now.
Psychoanalyze me.
We've come to this place now.
Okay, let's go with the opposite then. Let's go with the order of the universe is like a mechanical system and everything has a purpose.
It's not like a mechanical system exactly, but it's ordered and harmonious.
Okay, cool.
We've learned so much today. So the Renaissance science is based on Greek philosophy, which from its beginnings in the 6th century BCE found that the cosmos was an ordered and harmonious structure like a living organism rather than a mechanical system. Well, the Earth is a living organism, so true.
There you go.
How do you feel?
I need to read a few more books or maybe stay for today's lecture.
You know so many more than I did already. We're like science people doing this. This is great.
This is amazing.
Awesome. I think you did great. And I think we came up with some valuable lessons. I've already forgot what the first lesson was, but the second lesson was trust your gut. What was the first lesson that you mentioned? It was so
write everything down or you won't get credit for it.
Yeah. There we go. These are our 2 lessons from trivia.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us, Hafsa. I'll see you later. So now I would like to introduce our speaker. Stephanie Storey is an art historical novelist of Raphael, painter in Rome, out earlier this year in conjunction with the 500th anniversary of the artist's death, and of Oil and Marble, a novel of Leonardo and Michelangelo, which has been translated into 6 languages and is currently in development as a feature film by Pioneer Pictures. Storey is also a national TV producer of shows, including the Alec Baldwin Show on ABC, the Arsenio Hall Show on CBS, and the Emmy-nominated The Writer's Room for Sundance. Welcome, Stephanie. How are you? Oh, I think you're still muted. We'll get there. I think it's on the bottom of your screen. It'll kind of pop up when you move your mouse over it. You can stop sharing your screen, and then it might be easier to see where the mic button.
It was at the top. Usually it's at the bottom, but because I'm sharing my screen, it was at the top.
Well, we just learned another lesson. Thank you for that. Sometimes these things just move around for no reason. Thanks.
I thoroughly enjoyed watching you guys answer that trivia. It was my favorite thing. Now I just want to end the lecture right now and just go home on that because it was so good. Sorry.
We learned a lot.
Good.
I am so excited to hear your talk and learn all the answers I didn't know before. So take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. That really was a legitimate joy. And I wish I were in Portland tonight with everybody, as was the plan, but we will do our best to get this done in cyberspace now that I found my mute button. Okay. I want to begin tonight somewhere around the year 1460. Okay, picture the young Leonardo da Vinci. He's wandering around the rocky terrain of his home area, which is in the hills of Tuscany. Now, this is a picture that Leonardo made of that same area when he was in about his 20s. I just wanted to show it to you to give you an idea of the area that he grew up in and the area that he's walking around. Story I'm going to tell you, though, he's younger. He's about, let's say, 8, 10, 12, somewhere in there. And he's wandering around the landscape and he sees up in the distance a dark spot. He approaches it slowly and he finds the mouth of a gaping cave. It's like large, dark, foreboding. Now, every time I hear this story about Leonardo da Vinci, I think of the background of this painting, which is his Madonna of the Rocks. He did this when he was in his 30s. There's 2 versions of it. This is the one in the Louvre. But this is the landscape that I always think of whenever I hear this very, very common story about Leonardo. So young Leonardo stands at the edge of that cave. He doesn't dare enter. He just looks inside, trying to peer into the darkness to see what's in there. But he can't see anything. It's too dark. And Leonardo is seized by 2 different emotions at this moment. One, fear by what might be lurking inside of that dark cave. And 2, this desperate desire to find out what's in there. Now, as so often happens with Leonardo da Vinci during his lifetime, his curiosity wins out. And the young Leonardo da Vinci crawls down into this mossy cave. And of course, it takes his eyes a moment to adjust to the darkness, and he's feeling the sides of the cave. And it's bumpy. And then his eyes adjust, And what he sees embedded in the wall of that cave is a fossil of a giant whale. And he stands there marveling at the giantness of this fossil that's been embedded in the side of this wall and at its age, about how much has changed since this whale died, about the states that have fallen and the nations that have changed and the people that have died. And he stands there marveling at this wondrous thing in a dark cave. And it's that moment in Leonardo's life when he tells us in his notebooks that his desire for scientific discovery begins. That's also when I think we as people and history became fascinated with this guy's mind. Now, I'm lucky over the last 4 years, ever since my debut novel, Oil and Marble, came out, I've had the opportunity to travel around and talk to all kinds of museums. Now, granted, since I'm an art historical novelist, usually those museums are art museums, but I have a lot of science museums reach out to me too, just like this one. And it's because, no doubt, because of my association with Leonardo da Vinci, who is, I think arguably the most famous artist/scientist in all of history, right? Now, just so you wrap your brain around Leonardo, this is, of course, his most famous self-portrait. It was painted in 1512. It was drawn in 1512. It's now in the Royal Collection in Turin. He's about 60 years old here. And this is how we picture him, right? We picture him as this old, wizened scientist somehow. But this is actually my personal favorite statue or portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. This is a bronze statue of the young David standing over the severed head of Goliath, right? And it's done by a very famous sculptor at the time named Verrocchio. And Verrocchio used a young apprentice in his own workshop as the model for the statue. He wasn't yet 20. This is, according to legend, a portrait of Leonardo da Vinci. Verrocchio used Leonardo as his model for the David, which is extraordinary to me for many reasons. One, because like I said, we usually picture Leonardo as this old, wizened scientific figure, not this young, curious, handsome, brave, sort of, has himself out there, is confident almost to the point of arrogance here, right? That's the Leonardo that I picture solving all of these scientific problems and digging down into caves to find whale fossils. The other thing that this portrait does is every story that I'm going to tell you tonight, this should remind you that Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, Botticelli, Donatello, Verrocchio, they did not exist in their own bubbles. They weren't creating art on their own. They were living in the same cities, competing with each other and bumping into each other in the streets. So all of the scientific breakthroughs that they use in their art that I'm going to tell you about tonight happened within this collective, not on their own. And that's the Leonardo I wanted to show you. Anyway, so I guess I shouldn't be surprised that this version of Leonardo brings me to so many science museums, because he is the most famous artist/scientist. And in the pages of Oil and Marble, to be honest, I spend as much time on Leonardo's science as his art. As we talked about during the trivia, Leonardo spent a great deal of time dissecting humans and studying their inner anatomy. He also dissected bats and frogs and other animals. I also spent a great deal of time in my novel, and this is all throughout Leonardo's notebooks. He spent a great deal of time trying to solve the problem of human flight. So these are drawings from his notebooks. He was obsessed with being able to fly and build all kinds of flying machines. He was also obsessed with building military machines. Like this is his forerunner of a tank. This is a chariot. He also built catapults, scuba gear. I was talking about the trivia was talking about earlier. He even tried to use a series of levees and dams to divert the Arno River in an attempt to rob Pisa of a valuable water source during a war with Florence. So yes, He is a scientist. I can't imagine telling you the story of him as an artist without telling you the story of him as a scientist. Can't imagine it. So I'm not surprised whenever fans come up to me and want to talk to me about Leonardo, the scientist slash artist, and how extraordinary that is. Isn't that amazing that anybody could be both artist and scientist? Yeah, but there's a fundamental flaw with that shock that Leonardo was both artist and scientist, because that assumes that he was unique. You know, it's somehow people who talk to me seem to think that Leonardo was the only one who so brilliantly combined art and science. They think of people like, this is Michelangelo Buonarroti, Raphael Santi of Urbino, Sandro Botticelli. I mean, these are the giants of art history, right? And Donatello. That they were only artists, that maybe they used a little science, but it was secondary to their art. That it was really only Leonardo that did it full time. Before I move on, I want to set something a little bit straight about science during the Renaissance period. Okay? The Renaissance, of course, is that transitional period between the Middle Ages and our modern day world. And during this period, when Leonardo and these other giants of art history were young, a lot of people in their world still had a very medieval mindset. Science, in the modern way that you and I think of it, with, like the scientific method, leading the way in learning about the natural world, that did not exist yet. It did not exist. Yes, ancient philosophers like Aristotle had passed down knowledge about the natural world, but that knowledge was blended with Christian doctrine and theology. And the church condemned many scientific experiments at this time. Take, for example, the idea of dissecting a human body to study anatomy. Galileo, who is, of course, many people call the father of modern science, the founder of the scientific method, right? He was not born, Galileo was not born until 50 years after the death of Leonardo da Vinci. Galileo was born in 1564, the same year that Michelangelo died at almost age 89. When Michelangelo, Leonardo, and their contemporaries were working at the height of the Italian Renaissance, Galileo hadn't come along, the scientific method hadn't come along. We did not have science. And yet, a long time before Galileo, Michelangelo was using scientific thought to move his David across the streets of Florence, as we talked about in the trivia, and to use Brunelleschi's ideas from the creation of the dome in Florence to build and solve the problems that would allow architects and builders to build the dome of St. Peter's. And while that's going on, Leonardo da Vinci is taking all of his observations and all of his scientific experiments, and he's recording those in the pages of his notebooks. But neither of them thought of these scientific acts as separate from their art. They saw these duties as part of their art. Throughout their careers, they used what we would today call physics, math, engineering, chemistry, as we saw with needing to know, which pigments poison you, right? Today, now it seems like we're determined in our heads to separate math and science away from art, right? Like we go, right brain, left brain, analytical versus creative, science versus art. This past spring, my niece finished up her freshman year of college. Terrible year to be a freshman at college, but finished up her freshman year at college at my alma mater, Vanderbilt University. But whereas I studied art in the liberal arts school and got a Bachelor of Arts degree, she's in a whole different school. She's in an engineering school, and she will likely get a Bachelor of Science degree. A whole different degree for an entire other way of thinking. You know, I realize that right now I feel like STEAM and STREAM, you know, STEAM with adding the art and STREAM with adding the reading and writing to their acronyms are gaining in popularity. But the truth is, my niece is still walking around bragging that she's a hashtag STEM woman, which is great, but it's science, technology, engineering, math, and the arts are relegated to other. Look, I want to set something straight before I tell you my stories. I'm not a scientist. Yeah, I took like everybody does, right? I guess, I don't know, I did biology, physics, a lot of geology in college. I don't know, I was obsessed with rocks. And I do have, so I'm not a scientist. I do have an undergraduate degree in art history. I did study art in Italy. I did go try to get my PhD in art history. I didn't stay in that program. I studied under one of the top 5 Michelangelo specialists in the world, but I dropped out to go get my master's of fine arts and creative writing. So although I love art history, the reason why I traveled around to museums isn't because I'm an academic professor. The reason why I speak at museums is because I'm a historical novelist. It's because I write about artists from the Italian Renaissance. And as a historical novelist, what I do, what I'm an expert in, is taking complex stories from history and making them relatable to our lives today. So that's what I'm going to do here for the next, I don't know, probably 45 minutes, what I have left or so. I'm going to tell you a few stories from 500 years ago. Not about artists/scientists, but about people who didn't know that art and science were supposed to be separated by a slash. Look, this is not meant to be a comprehensive talk about all the ways in which art and science were connected during the Renaissance. That would take me 3 years at least. The stories I tell you are simply some of my personal favorite examples of how Italian Renaissance artists practicing art and science together, as though they were a single craft, a single way of thinking. No science versus art, but science serving art and art serving science. Okay, but despite the fact that I just told you that I write whole novels about Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael, I'm actually not going to start my talk with any of those three. In fact, the first story I'm going to tell you is not even the story of a single artist. It's the story of an artistic problem that took many artists 200 years to solve and only ended with a scientific breakthrough. And I'm glad that it's where I'm starting, because before we all started, we all came here before even the trivia started. You guys were talking about hoping to learning about linear perspective. So here we go. Back in the 13th century, 1200s, that's when artists first started to break out of the old medieval Byzantine painting and try to create more realistic scenes. And realism including wanting to create depth and perspective. Now, this is an altarpiece by a guy by the name of Cimabue. He's actually considered one of the first Renaissance artists, even though this obviously looks very old, right? It's very stylized, all very gold with the halos. It's all super flat. But I'll show you a couple of things. When you see this curve in this throne, that's an attempt to start giving depth to the picture. And these angels stacked one on top of each other. This is an old Byzantine trick, but Cimabue tries to push it forward a little bit. But basically, this angel standing in front of this angel, standing in front of this angel, standing in front of this angel, right? it's an attempt to show depth, as though there are four people standing in line. This is an attempt at perspective, no matter how ineffectual. Then we move on to people like Duccio, right? And he starts to put landscapes in the background, and we start to see a little bit more realistic figures. The shapes sort of seem more rounded. And then we get more famous names like Giotto, who starts using dark and light pigment, right, to create shadows. You can see them here and here and here. And then Giotto ends up, this one I love, because see, he's got these people here, but he's trying to add depth and a whole world in the background by adding these buildings. But look at them. They don't look real, do they? They look so flat. They almost look like Escher. They don't look like real buildings yet. Okay, so now that you have an idea of where we've come from in art, this flat world attempting to bend toward realism, but frankly failing, I'm going to jump forward to the early 15th century, to 1427. Nearly 150 years before Galileo is even born, we're in Florence to witness something that you and I might start to recognize as modern day science. Now, during these years in the early 15th century, there are primarily two painters. There are a whole lot of really famous sculptors and architects and other kinds of artists, but there are primarily two painters competing for every job in Florence at this time, all of them. And they're at the top of their game. Sometimes they even collaborate with each other, but they're competitors. One of them is named Masolino, Little Tom, and the other one is named Masaccio, or Messy Tom. Now, 1420s Florence is not an easy place to live. Food shortages affect everybody. I mean, unless you're the most wealthy or you're royalty, and frankly, food shortages even sometimes affect them too. There are armies marching across a divided peninsula. There are mercenaries who attack unattended travelers out on the roads. Plagues wipe out entire families and towns, something we all know a little bit more about these days. Losing a gig, losing pay means you're vulnerable to all of this and more. So competition for jobs was really fierce. And these two painters approached their art in really different ways. Masolino's work, all elegance, all pretty pictures, all like refinement. This is a very typical Masolino painting. Masaccio, however, is trying to create this whole world. He wants to do what artists have been trying to do for 200 years, create real depth with real perspective on a two-dimensional surface. If he can achieve such realism, he knows he can beat Masolino, his competitor. But how is he supposed to create a three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface, something that artists have been trying to do for 200 years? Now, he's already made some strides in this area on his own. See, he's adding shadows to this guy's list. This is his tribute money, by the way, which is a very famous painting for us art historians. He's adding shadows to try to add more depth. He's adding really complex shadows into the draperies. And look at this landscape, which is one of the things in one of the trivia questions, right? This is what's called atmospheric perspective. It's grayed out in the background. This is receding into the background just because there's a mountain back there. It's slightly smaller and it's gray. That's to suggest that it's receding into the distance. But it doesn't look like the real world to me. Does it to you? Or does it still look like, a painting? Masaccio's getting closer, but he can see, just like you and I can see, that this is not the real world yet. So at this point in art's evolution, the techniques of artists, shadows, here, the receding, the atmospheric perspective, the mountains in the background, that's not doing the job anymore. And that's never going to achieve a real world on a two-dimensional surface. In order to do that, Masaccio has to turn to an architect and sculptor named Brunelleschi, who is at this time conducting what we would no doubt call scientific experiments in the streets of Florence. Now, Brunelleschi is often credited with the invention of what we today call linear perspective. Through 5 years of experiments, looking at buildings, studying lines of sight, making calculations of angles, Brunelleschi discovered that if you're looking from a fixed single point, parallel lines in reality appear to converge at a single point in the distance. I'm actually going to show you something. If you look at just me, if you just look big at me and you just look at my box, you can see I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf that has lines in it. And you can see those lines. They're bigger up here. There's more distance between these bookshelves here than there is in these bookshelves here. It's smaller back here, right? Even though these are the same size bookshelves, exact same size bookshelves. You and I get to see these things easier because we live in a world in which pictures and video are constantly taking our 3D world and converging it down into a 2-dimensional picture. So it's easier for you and I to see this. It's the reason why a lot of artists sometimes use photographs to copy the real world, to paint the real world, because part of the work has already been done to compress it down into a 2-dimensional image. But this is 500 years ago, and Brunelleschi and Masaccio didn't have video and didn't have pictures. They had to figure this out through scientific observation. This is basically what they came up with. You have a horizon line. You have someone standing from a fixed point of view, and lines, parallel lines, will converge at a single vanishing point in the distance. Now, these orthogonals, as they are called, so something, if you put the same size object here, and you put it here, and you put it here, it will reduce in size, depending on where it is in the perspective line. This is not very well done. I did it in PowerPoint, so I was not as particular as Brunelleschi was. So this is the basic idea that Brunelleschi was starting to come up with. Now, he did experiments in the streets where he used mirrors and peepholes through the backs of pictures to try to demonstrate this idea of linear perspective to the people on the streets. But, and many historians sort of say that was a mark and a major step moving toward modern day science. Brunelleschi, with his mathematical calculations steeped in experimentation. But no one had yet put this linear theory into paint and paint alone. And that is where Masaccio, or Messy Tom, comes in. He's the first person to apply this scientific theory to paint. Now, Brunelleschi was trying to solve this theory, by the way, in order to make paintings look more real. That's the reason why Brunelleschi was out in the streets doing these experiments. It was to try to get art away from this, where the perspective isn't believable, and move it toward this. This is Masaccio's Holy Trinity. And this is his chapel. Now, none of this is paint. I mean, none of this is real. None of this is really carved. It's all paint. But it does appear as though he has physically carved a chapel into the wall of this church. And the reason why is he's using linear perspective. You can see it pretty clearly in the lines of the barrel vault. These are slightly larger than these. It's subtle, but it's there. And so he used the lines of perspective from here. You could just flip that on its head. And that's what Masaccio used in order to create this. And that's how we started to move toward scientific experimentation, was because artists were simply trying to solve a problem of how to create an optical illusion of making a 3-dimensional space on a 2-dimensional surface. Now, just to wrap up the Masolino versus Masaccio story, for those of you who were, I don't know, invested or something, Masaccio actually dies shortly after finishing this painting at 27 years old. Masolino lives another 20 years, but it's Masaccio's work that used science to move forward the optical illusion of creating realism on a two-dimensional surface that changes art forever. A guy by the name of Leon Battista Alberti, who's a famous architect, writes Da Pictura in 1435, and he lays out all of these in writing. You have to write it down in order to get credit for it. I'll never forget that. In writing, he writes this stuff down, and he sort of solidifies the theories of linear perspective in this book, Da Pictura, which is a treatise on painting. And then about 100 years after Masaccio, a guy by the name of Raphael really perfects this three-dimensional world on a two-dimensional surface in his School of Athens. And again, one of the easiest places to see the perspective lines are in the walls up here and in the barrel vaults at the top, where you can see this receding. It's getting smaller. And he's using those same linear perspective lines. You can also see them in the floor, although they're more subtle. Okay, as long as we've stopped for a moment on Raphael's School of Athens, I do have to point something out since we're talking about art and science at the same time. Raphael used, so this is all a bunch of Greek philosophers standing on the stairs of Athens, in ancient Athens, supposedly. And Raphael used many of his artist companions and compatriots and colleagues to stand in as models for these great Greek philosophers. This is Plato, as played by Leonardo da Vinci. This is Heraclitus, who was a very sort of pessimistic Greek philosopher, played by Michelangelo. Here's the little tiny head of Raphael peeking out, for those of you who are curious. And this is Raphael's friend and mentor, an architect by the name of Bramante, playing the role of Euclid, the mathematician. And this is for no reason other than to highlight that for the artists of the Renaissance, artists and scientists and mathematicians were literally quite fused into one person. Okay, but speaking of fused and the School of Athens, I want to talk about fresco. Because if that was a mathematical problem using scale and measurements in order to create perspective, frescoing and everything about frescoing, from the plaster to the paints, is one giant chemistry problem. Okay, so fresco, for those of you who don't know, for those of you who do know, forgive me, I need to explain to people at home a little bit about fresco technique. Okay, so fresco is the act of painting directly into wet plaster. So you take paint, so you paint directly into wet plaster, so that when the wet plaster dries, it becomes part of the wall. The School of Athens, the painting that I have up on the slide, that is a fresco. Raphael painted directly into the wall, into wet plaster. It dried, leaving this painting there. Okay? So before beginning a traditional fresco, the first thing you have to do is you have to clear the wall of all previous decoration. And then you have to sand down all the irregularities. You have to get it really smooth. And then you have to lay down a foundation of new plaster and let it dry. Then the final layer of plaster that artists lay down. When you're ready to mix it, it is mixed. It's called an intonico, and it's mixed from a combination of water, lime, and sand, or sometimes marble dust or river mud or other sort of grainy surfaces like that. The artists then take a small patch of that plaster and apply it to the wall, just enough to be completed in one day and one day only. It's called a giornata, a day's work. You transfer, so you have this just small patch of plaster on the wall, and it corresponds to a small patch of the fresco design you've made. So you've already designed this whole School of Athens thing. You've got every picture down there, and I'll actually show it to you now. Here it is. This is a copy of Leonardo's preparatory drawing for this fresco. This fresco came from this. So he had it all worked out. So he takes the one little part, the one little part that corresponds to the piece of plaster you laid down. And then you poke tiny little holes on every single line in that drawing. And then you take that portion of that drawing and you put it up against the wet plaster, and you take a little charcoal pouncing bag and you pounce over it, leaving little bits of charcoal through the little holes, leaving a ghosted outline of the design in the plaster that the artist can use to paint from. Okay? Artists grind their pigments. Next, artists grind their pigments. So you take materials from the real world, like we were talking about earlier. You take lapis stones, or you take a mercury sulfite, or you take copper, and you grind it down using a mortar and a pestle into a tiny grain. And then you mix that with water, only water. You don't mix it with any other kind of binding agent that would counteract with the plaster. And you paint that pigment directly into the plaster. And then as it dries, that's bound permanently to the wall. Now, in order to do this, an artist had to paint very quickly. You only had that day to finish that section. Once it dried, you're done. You don't get to there's no do-over. There are two do-overs. You can cut it off and start completely again. You have to start completely back over on the entire section. Or technically, some artists add a secco touches, little dry touches of paint to the wall. Okay, these have to have a binding agent with them. They don't last very long. Oftentimes, they flake off. Now, artists, in order to do this well, had to have two things. They had to have the whole fresco planned already, and they had to paint so seamlessly that no viewer at home could see the divisions between each giornata. This fresco has, and I can't remember how many it has now. I think 41 giornata. I can't remember. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, you can't see the seams between them. Raphael knew exactly what he was painting, and he painted them so carefully between each day's work that you can't see the divisions. It's really tough. One other thing you have to understand, the composition of plaster, that plaster mix, that sand, lime, and water, right? That you have to mix together to make the plaster, it changes depending on the climate, how much air comes through the space, how much sunlight hits the wall, to make the plaster too thick, and it will dry too fast, not leaving the artist enough time to paint the entire giornata. Make the plaster too wet, and it won't dry properly, and it could mold, as Michelangelo learned while painting his Sistine Ceiling. It's true. While Michelangelo's painting his Sistine Ceiling, he ended up using a fresco mix that had worked well for him up in Florence. But when he got down to Rome, it was too humid, and the plaster didn't dry properly, and it molded, and he had to destroy 3 months of work. Now, if you're ever curious, if you're looking at the Sistine, you want to know which part he destroyed. He had to destroy the part of the flood, right? The famous flood from the Old Testament. That's the panel he had to destroy and paint again. It's okay. He eventually got the plaster mix right, obviously, because we still have the Sistine, right? Okay, but if you're thinking, as I already said, that this mixing a fresco plaster thing is sounding a lot like chemistry, just wait. Because frescoists also had to know which pigments interacted properly with that plaster. Remember, plaster is made from lime. Now, lime is a heated and hydrated calcium carbonate that has very high pH levels. I'm not going to tread too deeply into the science here because, frankly, there are a lot of internet scientists who can do a lot better job than I can. So go Google them if you want to see how lime is slaked. But what you and the artists back then had to know is that not all pigments could withstand the high alkalinity of fresco. You couldn't use them all. For example, ultramarine, which is the most expensive pigment in the Italian Renaissance. It's found in the blue of this sky and in the blue of these draperies. This is Titian's Ariadne, Bacchus and Ariadne. It's the mark of a great painting in the Renaissance. but its base is basically soft glass. And the alkalinity of plaster eventually destroys its color and it turns a whitish gray. It's out of bounds for frescoists. There are many other bright blues and greens, azurite, malachite, both made of copper carbonates, and the bright red, orange, of vermilion made of mercury sulfite that are also out of bounds for frescoists because of their basic chemistry. Now, the only way to use these kinds of pigments on a fresco is to mix them with a binder like egg yolk and add them to the dry plaster, a technique I referred to earlier as a secco. But the problem with that is, like I said, it doesn't last very long. It tends to flake off. So again, this is out of bounds for frescoists, unless you are Leonardo da Vinci, of course. Now, which leads me to a famous story about Leonardo and the science of fresco. And when Leonardo was a young artist, most Italians still use a paint called egg tempera. Okay, it's ground pigments mixed with egg yolk. Nothing more than that, honestly, and a little bit of water. Water, egg yolk, ground pigment. And the egg yolk is the agent that will bind those grains of pigment together and then bind them to the wooden panel that it's painted on. When it dries, it binds. It's highly stable. It lasts a really long time, egg tempera does. And it's also really fast drying. So it dries within seconds. Like you put a little brush on and it's dry. There's no time to blend colors. The colors are bright and flat. This is a very good example of an egg tempera painting. It's by Raphael. It's called The Knight's Vision or The Knight's Dream. And all of this shading is just from actually putting little strips, little lines of white over the blue. That's the only kind of shading there was. You actually had to apply new paint on the top. You couldn't actually blend. Okay. But Leonardo did not like this. Leonardo loved using oils as his base. He experimented with many different kinds of oils: walnut, mustard seed, cypress gum, juniper needle, and linseed oil, which had been made famous. Linseed oil is first made famous by great northern painters like Jan van Eyck, seen here. This is sort of the most famous early oil painting from the early 15th century. Leonardo preferred oil paints. One, because oils dry much slower, giving him tons of time to move paint around, correct his mistakes, perfect his ideas, and blend colors on the palette or on the picture itself. This is sort of a famous example of Leonardo's sfumato technique, which is called smoky. It's smoky. It's where the shadow sort of goes from dark to light in a painting. This is one of Leonardo's sort of famous techniques. It's what he's known for. And it wouldn't be possible without the blending capability of oil paints because of the length of time that it takes them to dry. Now, Leonardo, this is just a side note, he often blended colors with his fingers right on the picture. I couldn't find one that had been released in the public domain, but go online and look up Leonardo da Vinci's fingerprints in paint, and you will find them. You will find examples of his fingerprints in paint. He physically blended the paint on the canvas. You can't do that with tempera. By the way, you also can't do that with fresco. Okay, so, and he could also, in addition to blending, he could also do a lot of glazes. He could make deep, rich colors by doing thin, transparent glaze over thin, transparent glaze because of the consistency of oil paints. They could be made almost translucent. So Leonardo was commissioned to fresco a scene on a wall of a refectory at Santa Maria del Grazia in Milan in the 1490s. He's like 40 years old. And he didn't want to paint fast and precise flat blocks of color as required by fresco. He wanted to use oils. Okay? I mean, here's another very famous fresco that was painted 10 years before the one I'm talking about. This is Perugino's Christ Giving the Keys to St. Peter's, which is on the walls of the Sistine Chapel. You can see that the colors are flat. They're beautiful, but they're not that smoky, deep quality that Leonardo prefers. Leonardo wanted to take his time. He didn't want to plan ahead. He wanted to be able to change the picture as his mind changed. He wanted to improvise while he worked. That's who Leonardo was. Famously, he liked to stand in front of his paintings for hours, stare at it, make one brush stroke, and then go out for a walk to think some more. He didn't want to stand in front of a painting and work all day from sunrise to sunset to finish a single giornata. Plus, Leonardo didn't want to limit his color choice. Ultramarine was the mark of a great painting. He didn't want to have to work without it or with malachite or vermilion just because they were incompatible with fresco. I picture Leonardo da Vinci in his studio, in his laboratory in these days, like a modern day chemist, pots bubbling, mixing plasters and pigments, trying to find a way not to bend his creative technique to fresco, but to bend fresco toward his creative technique. First, he wanted to use oils on a wall. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be able to shade and blend and glaze. But oils would never bind to a wall, no matter what kind of plaster you used. It just wouldn't work. So first, he created a brand new paint mixture of oil and egg called egg tempera. Paint that would give him some of the depth and flexibility of oils, but with the binding power and stability of egg yolk. But then, how is he going to use these new pigments on a wall? He couldn't apply oil and egg to a lime-based plaster. That's crazy. It would have counteracted and the color would have spoiled. So, Leonardo turned away from a traditional fresco technique of painting directly into wet plaster. Instead, he developed his own brand new thin layer of plaster made from a calcium carbonate mixed with magnesium and animal glue, which would be the binding agent that would adhere the pigment to the wall. Once this layer had dried, he added a base coat of lead white to seal the plaster and add more luminosity to his colors. As it was said during the trivia earlier, yes, some paints, there were lots of paints that poisoned artists, including lead. Lead white is made with strips of lead and horse manure and vinegar. That's how you make lead white. And working with it for long periods of time did tend to give you lead poisoning. Now, somehow Leonardo da Vinci shows no signs of lead poisoning. I'm not quite sure how. I don't think anybody knows how. Anyway, so this experimental fresco technique, now it's not really fresco, right? Since he wasn't using fresh plaster. Let Leonardo be Leonardo, adding paints in successive layers, slowly applying 4 or 5 different separate coats to build up colors and shapes and a whole scene. It gave him more ability to shade and blend to create realistic flesh tones and shadows. And he had more time to make changes and work on gestures and shadows and expressions. His scientific mind to give him a new kind of plaster to go on a wall gave him the ability to forget about the physical demands of fresco painting and focus on capturing real people. For those of you who haven't figured it out, this painting that he worked on in creating the experimental fresco technique is his Last Supper. This is arguably one of the most famous works in all of art history. And I'm saying it's arguably one of the most famous works in all of art history precisely because of the scientific breakthroughs that Leonardo had. Because he wouldn't have been able to develop the shading and the expressions and the subtlety and the colors without that experimental fresco technique. By the way, there's also examples of linear perspective in this painting that you can look at. He was improvising as he worked. Now, sadly, Leonardo's breakthrough scientific experiment was also a failure in many ways. This fresco didn't hold up, and the pigment started peeling off the wall before Leonardo even died. Before the latest restoration in 1999, This was a ghost of a painting. There was hardly any pigment left. And today, if you go see it, you still have to walk through a series of air-locked doors to try to prevent it from decaying even more. Look, Leonardo's experimental fresco technique may have failed in the science department, but at least his art survived. In this next case, if the science had failed, it would have completely destroyed one of the most beloved pieces of art in all of history. It's May 1504. Once again, we're in Florence, and Michelangelo has just finished his David. Now, it's nicknamed the Giant by locals. It's a colossal marble statue, about 17 feet tall, weighing more than 12,500 pounds. Now, Michelangelo had carved his David in a workshop outside of Florence's cathedral, but the statue was to be displayed permanently on a pedestal outside of City Hall in Piazza della Signoria. This is actually the, right down here, this little guy, that's the replica of David. Okay, it's about a quarter of a mile away, this building is, from the cathedral workshop. Now, you might not think about it now, but 500 years ago, how was Michelangelo supposed to move such a statue? I mean, back in 1504, which is when the David is finished, no one has carved a colossal marble statue in over 1,000 years, not since ancient Rome, much less moved one over uneven, narrow streets of Florence. Legend has it that the ancient Greeks had tried to pull this great marble statue, a great masterpiece, now lost, it's now gone, down a soft grassy hill to its pedestal. But as they dragged it, they broke its legs. And so they dumped it into a quarry because it was no longer a masterpiece, it was garbage. And that was the fate that David was going to face if Michelangelo couldn't figure out how to move it safely. Now, for the entire move from the cathedral to City Hall, David would need to remain upright. Lowering him to his side and raising him to his feet again was too risky. The original block of marble that David was carved from, it was called the Duccio stone, had been shallow in the middle and really brittle after being stored outdoors for several decades after it was quarried. Michelangelo had designed David's weight for standing up. If he moved him to a horizontal position, the weight might bow inwards and crack David's slender waist. But moving him upright created a different set of problems, right? David was so tall, 17 feet tall, that workmen had to take down the archway over the entrance to the cathedral workshop because David never would have fit underneath it. And what about all those low-hanging balconies on the road obstructing their path? David's height wasn't the only issue, right? The statue's knees were thin, his ankles even thinner. If it jostled the wrong way, even for a second, those weak knees and ankles could break, and the whole thing would collapse and shatter. What if the wood cracked, the rope split, a runaway horse galloped down the street at the wrong time? Now, you might think that you would need a strong, solid, immobile contraption, maybe a lot of padding to move David safely, right? That's not what Michelangelo did. With the help of architects Antonio and Giuliano da Sangallo, he designed a unique contraption to move David. They constructed a very strong wooden framework, but instead of tying and bolting David down securely, making him immobile, they suspended David within the framework with a series of ropes and slip knots, like a swing, so that when they moved, the statue could sway gently without breaking. They let it give, much like we design buildings today to withstand the shock of earthquakes. Now, using ropes and pulleys, Michelangelo had to hire more than 40 men to lift up David and lower him into his swing. They started moving him at midnight on May 14th, 1504. David is swinging in his contraption atop a wooden platform, rolling on top of 14 logs or rollers. As workers pushed the platform forward and then removed the rear roller and carried it to the front, the workers moved the platform forward again, releasing another log out the back. And so, one log at a time, David swayed and made his way from the cathedral workshop to his pedestal in front of City Hall. The trip took 4 days. Vandals threw rocks at him and he had to be guarded at night, but painfully slowly, David crossed the streets of Florence. And once he arrived at his destination, it took another 3 weeks to raise David out of his swing and lower him safely onto his pedestal in front of City Hall. If David and his team of artists had failed as engineers, we wouldn't still have the David. This is not the only engineering problem that Michelangelo had to solve during his lifetime. In order to create and safeguard his art, here's one last favorite story, this time about the Sistine. Now, painting the Sistine Ceiling was almost an impossible task for too many reasons to recount here. But one of the major problems was how Michelangelo was supposed to build a scaffolding that would allow him to get all the way up there to paint. A traditional scaffolding would have stood on the floor of the chapel and risen all the way up to the ceiling. But that was not possible in this case because such a scaffolding would have taken up the floor of the chapel. And the Pope insisted that he still be able to hold services in the chapel while Michelangelo was working. Bramante, the guy who posed as Euclid earlier in the School of Athens, he was the official papal architect and Michelangelo's sworn rival, suggested suspending the scaffolding from ropes hanging from the ceiling. When Michelangelo asked what he was supposed to do about the gaping holes that would be left in the ceiling that would be required to anchor such ropes to safely hold the scaffolding, Bramante shrugged and said Michelangelo would have to figure that out and just fill those holes in later. That was not going to do for Michelangelo and his ceiling. So he designed his own scaffolding. It was an inventive array of connected footbridges anchored into the wall above the old famous frescoes already decorating the walls of the chapel below, but beneath the new sections of ceiling being prepped for new paint that Michelangelo was going to paint. To reach the bottom rungs of the scaffolding, workers had to climb up freestanding ladders. But once you were up there, you were free to travel from one footbridge to the other, spanning a full half of the ceiling, had to be taken down and rebuilt to paint the second half. These footbridges, by the way, swayed a little to give with the weight of paints and men and supplies so they didn't crack during painting. It was rather high, by the way. It felt very unstable. And so Michelangelo had to hang tarps beneath the scaffolding so that as he's painting, he's not constantly looking over thinking about how far above the marble floor he is working. Anyway, with these two stories, it is no wonder that in addition to being the greatest sculptor in history, one of its greatest painters, that Michelangelo also became the engineer to successfully solve the problem of building the dome for the new St. Peter's Basilica. But time's running out, so that story of science and art and the way Brunelleschi's two-nested domes work will have to wait for another day or another novel. Look, in this short speech, I did not cover most of the ways Psi artists worked during the Renaissance. I didn't talk about arguably the most famous example of art converging with science during the Renaissance, which is Leonardo da Vinci's famous Vitruvian Man. But that story of ideal human proportion has been told over and over again, and there are plenty of places where you can go and search it out. I also didn't talk about the golden ratio as it applies to design during the Renaissance, or the study of light and how it strikes various objects to create various optical illusions. This is another page from Leonardo's notebooks about the study of light and how it strikes the face. Or the physics problems that sculptors casting large bronze statues would face. Leonardo was once famously commissioned to cast a large bronze equestrian statue for the Duca Sforza in Milan. This is a drawing for it. And he wanted the horse to rear back on his hind legs with his front legs rising up off the ground. It was a serious physics problem in how he would ever get that statue to stand. There is so much that I did not have time to cover. But to be honest, I wasn't trying to cover it all. And I wasn't even trying to go into scientific detail. I was simply trying to introduce you to some of the ways art and science didn't just commingle during the Renaissance, but how they fed off of each other. How without art, we might not have science. And how without science, we surely would not have art. So look, I was also trying to inspire you to maybe go learn about the Renaissance and my personal 3 favorite guys, Michelangelo, Leonardo, and Raphael. Or inspire you to go and look and think about how art and science should not be so separate. Maybe aren't so separate, not in our own time, but how they've always been and how they always will be one and the same. So that's my little art talk, art and science talk, about how art and science were all the same in the Renaissance. And and then these are my books.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was amazing. You're a great storyteller. That was really engaging.
Oh, good. Well, I'm glad, because it's hard to make. I love this stuff, but it can be hard to make complex issues like science and art like tell you enough so you get what's happening. Because like perspective, it's hard, dude. It's hard to understand.
Yeah, man. I remember all those classes in like middle school art, and you're trying to learn perspective, and like even when you have the formulas and the theory, it's hard. And so I can't imagine like not even having that conceptual framework and trying to create perspective.
That's right. They had no idea. They were working with those old like Cimabue, like let's just stack people on top of each other. Maybe that will make it look like perspective. And I did just like right when I sat down and we were talking, that's when I thought of throwing this in, because I thought, well, you can actually see perspective behind me in a 2-dimensional way that that's not possible without pictures.
Yeah, it works perfectly. Are you ready to answer some audience questions?
I will do my best.
Yeah, take a drink of water first to get ready. Okay. One question was, you mentioned that Da Vinci also dissected bats as well as humans. And we were wondering if he got ideas for his flying machine designs from the bats, or like of all things, why bats? Yeah.
Because he was obsessed with everything that flew. He really was. Like, he not only studied the bat dissection thing fascinates me. There's a book called The Science of Leonardo. Oh, and I wish I could remember the guy's name, but I know that's the title of the book, is The Science of Leonardo. Capra maybe is the author's last name. And he talks about all of the dissections that Leonardo da Vinci did, his bat dissections, his frog dissections. He actually dissected live frogs sometimes to try to understand what would happen to a live animal, which is crazy because he was also a vegetarian. He was also this like almost an animal activist at the time. So it's sort of this strange juxtaposition to me. But yeah, one of the reasons why he dissected bats is because he was trying to figure out how to make a particular set of wings. He designed a bunch of different flying machines. One of them, if you look back through his notebooks, looks a lot like actual bat wings. And that may have been, we don't know for sure, he apparently, according to his notebooks, did actually go try to run an experiment where he strapped one of these flying machines on his back and he jumped off a mountain. And apparently it didn't work because he didn't record it. Like, he only said, I'm going to go do this. And then he doesn't tell us how it goes. So we assume it failed massively because Leonardo would have told us. But it may have been the bat wings. But yeah, he was trying to figure out how he could get up in the air because that's all he wanted to do.
That's great. It's like when I used to jump off my stairs wearing a cape when I was a kid.
Right? That's what he's doing. Like one of my favorite quotes is like, once you've tasted flight, you can never go back to the earth or something. Like he's so like, once he gets up in the air, he never wants to come back down. He just wants to live up there. It's one of my favorite things about him is that the notebooks are filled with flying machines and attempts to get himself up in the air. He also studies water to do the same thing, by the way. He thinks that maybe the way water moves might mimic the way air moves. So one of the reasons why he's so obsessed with water movement is because he thinks it will help him learn to fly.
That's awesome. Man, there's so much here. Okay, my next question. You mentioned this a little bit, but with the Last Supper painting, they heard that it was breaking up because of the humidity of the wall on which it was painted. And people are wondering what steps are being taken to preserve that painting. Well,
yes. So part of the reason why the experimental fresco technique failed was one, because it just was not as durable as painting directly into the wet plaster and having it dry and having it become part of the wall, right? So it's just less durable than that. So that's part of the reason why it started flaking. The other reason why is because probably he miscalculated a little bit. Just like I said earlier, where you have to change the consistency of the plaster. You have to change that combination in order for it to dry and hold properly. He probably miscalculated a little bit about how much humidity was held in that room. I mean, he didn't have, what's the machine that measures humidity? Why can't I think of it? Why am I drawing a blank? Oh, there's something like a thermometer that measures humidity, and I can't think of the word. I'm not going.
Is it a barometer? I should know this as a science human.
Barometer is air pressure, I think. Anyway,
yeah, you're right.
Anyway, he didn't have a machine to measure the humidity in that room. But yes, the humidity is a major problem, which is the reason why when you go today, so if you've been to go see The Last Supper, you actually go through a set of airlock doors, much like entering like security doors in a bank. Mm-hmm. Where you enter, like airlock doors open up, you all walk in, you have to get a timed ticket. There are only a certain number of people allowed inside at a time. So you go in with your like 20 little time ticket people, you go in this airlock door and the door in front of you is still closed. And you're in this little airlock chamber and they hold you there for a certain amount of time to make sure that the air is all whatever, dried out, because they think they blow you and stuff. And then the next set of doors opens and then you can all actually enter the church. Or the refectory. It was actually the dining hall of that convent. But they restored it. They did a major restoration in 99. So I saw it before the restoration. I've seen it since the restoration. Before the restoration, there was not much paint left, guys. Now they've they've added, they do what restorers do, and they make their best estimates. They're using sort of strips of paint and going, well, this is where this paint was, and they're filling in a little bit. And you can actually now see it, which is nice because you can actually now experience the painting. The other big thing that happened to that building is during World War II, there were bombs dropped on Milan. And that was the only wall of that refectory that survived, was the Last Supper wall. Everything, there are pictures as you're going up to it, and there are pictures, and it's all been destroyed except Leonardo's Last Supper survived, which Leonardo would just love that story. Oh, it was.
I bet it was the binding. It just held it together enough.
Right? It was the animal glue, man.
Awesome. We have a couple more questions about the binders and about some of his paint concoctions.
Sure.
Besides egg and water, did he try other binding materials? You mentioned an animal product. Was that like an oil or?
Oils were his favorites. And he tried a ton of, he like melted everything down trying to create oils. The cypress gum and like different needles of different trees he would try to melt down into oils. Anything he could find, walnuts, any sort of nut, anything that might produce an oil, he would press it. So he really did have a laboratory. I sort of wasn't kidding when I said he reminds me of a chemist. he has presses and he's pressing all this stuff, trying to get the oil, and then he's got to boil it. And you could boil it at different temperatures too. So it wasn't just, you didn't just boil it once and see what happened. You boiled some hotter, you boiled it longer. You got it to different temperatures to find the right viscosity for what he wanted, particularly depending upon the paint. So mainly it's egg yolk, water, and oil. Although it wouldn't surprise me if he tried other stuff. Yeah. I also read that he tried all different kinds of things for different pigments that are not like normal pigments at the time. That he would just sort of pick up anything, grind it down, and see if it would work. But one of like the scientific things about his brain on that front is he loved books and he had them, but he didn't necessarily trust what he read. He wanted to go out and experiment with it with his own hands and his own eyeballs. And if he couldn't do it and he couldn't see it, it's like he didn't believe it had happened. So I picture him doing that with all of the different types of oils and pigments. He was doing those for himself as much as for anybody.
Did he use like tallow or like animal bait, like lard kind of?
Yeah. I think that's on the list. I know he used bone.
Okay.
There's such a big list of stuff and it all sort of melds together in my brain. They're a great book. They're the Science of Leonardo book and The Last Supper by Ross King. That's the one that really breaks down the kinds of paints he used, particularly in The Last Supper. If you're interested, that's a great book on Leonardo da Vinci.
Ooh, yeah. My other sort of on the topic of oils, I don't know if this is maybe outside of your wheelhouse, but
who knows?
Does like the fat content oils affect how the paint works? Is that like a sort of a continuum on like fat content of oil versus like the quality of the pigment that comes through?
So. So I know that he worked a lot with different levels of thickness and transparency levels, depending upon what he wanted to achieve with his paints. So like all of his different paintings, apparently, I don't get in there with the, I just read what other people tell me. But apparently, he used different thickness levels and different transparency. And I presume the fat level of whatever he was using was part of that. I don't know if he consciously knew that. Like I've never seen that referenced in his notebooks as something that he personally would have even known to measure. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't even know if fat content was a thing at the time yet. I think we know that now. I don't know if he knew that or not. I've never read that. He could. Please, if he did, tell me, and then I'll throw it in a book somewhere. I'll start talking about fat content. I don't know. Yeah.
We'll do our like saturated and unsaturated fat paint.
Yeah, he definitely didn't have that. He didn't know that the almonds were the good oil. He just knew he liked the oil for the painting. I don't know.
Awesome. Oh, I might be freezing a little bit. Can you see?
You've frozen a little, but you're in and out.
Can you see?
You're back now. Look at you.
Am I back? Okay. This is segueing nicely into some of these other questions around healthy paint versus not healthy paint. There's a couple around the lead paint. Someone asked if Leonardo, or maybe they meant Michelangelo instead, avoided lead poisoning by making assistants, like apprentices, do the grunt work. And so they weren't touching the paint as much.
Well, maybe because they had known that lead, particularly lead white, is the major paint that's made with lead at the time. And they had known that had been toxic to humans since Roman times. And certainly they didn't know why. They didn't really understand lead poisoning per se, but they had known for like 1,000 years that it was toxic to people. And certainly assistants do a lot of this, the grinding and like all of the plaster stuff I was talking about, of how they apply particular small bit of, they mix the plaster and they apply that part of plaster, and then they pounce the painting and all that. That's all done by assistants. So a lot of times it's not the artists themselves grinding the pigment. Now I say that Leonardo, again, was a huge experimenter with his own pigments, and he liked having control, at least over the initial creation of them. He got bored super fast, so he wasn't likely to remake the same pigment over and over again. Michelangelo, from the time he was young, claims he hates to paint. So most of painting, he's trying to push off onto assistants. Raphael, the other major of the triumvirate, has a huge workshop that's working for him. And he's a really collaborative guy. So even though he would have been in there chatting with them, they were probably creating the lead white. So yeah, probably that's how he got away with it. But you're still, as the artist, you're still interacting with it a lot. People would have thought he would have shown some sort of sign of, but then again, how do we know? We don't have videos of him. I don't know if he was having a little mental lapse a couple days or not, you know?
Yeah. Why did they use lead for that white paint?
It was really because it created a really bright luminescent white. Like if you go look at the whites of this period, the brightest white, the one that like glows off the panel, the one that sort of adds that real was lead white. That's just what it was. I don't know how they came up with it. Again, they'd had it since ancient Roman times. I want to know why the Romans first picked lead. Like other things you start grinding it down. I guess when you grind it down, because I know you fire it first. I think when you grind it down, it must just create a really bright white powder.
Awesome. More toxic paint questions. Are there some like typical symptoms that painters broadly showed that they're being poisoned by their paint?
Well, lead makes lead causes neurological problems. That's like lead poisoning now. Like lead in your water can cause brain damage. Some of them just made you sick. I mean, it's whatever you're sort of corresponding to, like mercury poisoning. Sometimes you just got like violently, they were all different. They were on a different scale depending upon what kind of poisoning you were getting. Was it arsenic poisoning, or was it mercury poisoning, or was it lead poisoning? It's all of those basic. Some of them make you really sick to your stomach. Some of them make you mentally have tics. I've read somewhere of shaking, but that they knew the lead poisoning was certainly, I think, obvious. I think people had like stroke-like symptoms, basically. I think that's obvious a lot. Not good.
Yeah.
And keep in mind, painters, a lot of them, Raphael was famous for licking. And then Van Gogh, is it Van Gogh? Oh, one of them thought some like vermilion tasted really good because it was like sweet. So he keeps licking it. And like, that's probably why you went crazy, Vincent.
Maybe, yeah, like mercury, licking mercury.
Yeah, thought it tasted good. I don't know. they do with their fingers. So it's not just, it's also you're ingesting it.
Mm-hmm. Oof. Okay. This is a scientific method question. How did the experimenting painters know what would last a long time? They didn't have very much time to observe it before deciding.
Like, well, first of all, like what? One. So one, they're working off of just in general, how did they decide what was going to work? You had known for hundreds of years, or at least 200 years, that ultramarine turned white gray. So that was something you would have learned as an apprentice under your master when you were learning to paint, right? So when Leonardo's in Verrocchio's workshop, Verrocchio is passing down knowledge that he's gotten from previous generations. So in that way, it's just like regular learning, right? So some of this is passed down knowledge. The other part, what's working and what's not in the painting, I guess I need a more specific, I don't know. I don't really, I don't know. Do you know what exactly? I don't know.
I think like thinking that these frescoes, and if they were trying new ways of like creating frescoes, so I guess it'd be Da Vinci, like, and wanting this to last for many hundreds of years, and you're creating something new, like how do you decide what you think will last for hundreds of years?
Oh, got it. Yeah, he didn't know. And that's why the Last Supper didn't work, right? He failed. They were trying to make, I mean, he was trying to make his best guess in like combining oils with tempera paint, with yolk. That was his best guess that they knew, because we've had tempera paints by this time. They already have tempera paintings that are 300, 400, 500 years old. So you already know that egg yolk is working and it's lasting a really long time. So you know it's a really stable binder. So he was just using that knowledge, trying to combine it with oils, hoping that it would last. He was just making pretty good educated choices. Yeah, but that's also part of the reason why Leonardo is one of the only people who did experiment with this stuff. You know, Michelangelo and Raphael and Botticelli, and they all stuck with really traditional fresco because they knew from like Pompeii, like ancient Rome, that fresco worked and that fresco was going to last. So most of them didn't experiment that much in the materials. They experimented in the perspective because that you could just try and try again. In the materials itself, Leonardo is rare in his willingness to experiment and willingness to maybe lose a painting like he did.
Yeah. Awesome. I think that might be all of our questions.
That's not a bad thing, because that was nerve-wracking. I was like, oh my gosh, what if I don't know what if they ask me one and I'm like, I have no clue what's happening right now. I don't know anything about that. At least those I knew something about.
Yeah. Well, you know what? It's actually really heartening to like see people that are experts. They don't know all of science or all of art, right? We're like admitting that there's always more to learn. So
that's the gorgeous thing about it. I would not be a historical novelist if there wasn't more to go out and research and learn and put into the books. Oh, yeah. Wait, can I tell people? Go to Pals to buy your books, because I love independent bookstores and we need to support them right now. So please go to Pals to get copies of my Raphael, which just came out in April. That's about the rivalry between Raphael and Michelangelo. And this is about the rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo. And there's lots of this, you know, fresco and toxic paints and moving David and building scaffolding. There's lots of that stuff in there because I like it.
Yeah, it just shows such a great story around the artworks, and it just makes them so much more alive.
Yeah, you got to throw some of that stuff in. You got to throw like the real people, and then the drama of moving the David.
Yeah.
Yeah, so go to Pals to buy your books. If you want to read other books, I also host a show like this. I also host a show on YouTube on my channel called Team Story, where I talk to other writers about their works. So if you want to hear me talk more, you can go there. Or when I talk to other people like you're doing to me. That's it.
Actually, we had 2 questions come just under the wire, and we do technically have time. So I know you thought you were being clear. I've got two more questions. People are like, who knows the end? Okay. Did the Chinese who had ancient frescoes ever improve on techniques that we hear of from Europeans, or did you know if they had different techniques entirely?
I took like 3 Eastern art classes when I was in undergraduate and graduate school, and that was 25 years ago, kids. Now, I do have a hope in my brain. I have a Japanese artist that I really want to write about. And so I'm hoping to get towards Japan and China more. I could try to BS my way through that question. I won't, because I know that the Chinese did have extraordinary talents. And I love a lot of Chinese and Japanese art. I put them together in my mind because that's the class I took, was Chinese and Japanese. But I don't know what their fresco or what their painting techniques were like. Like, honestly, I know the Italian Renaissance, and now I'm learning a little bit about France. You know, like when you go this deep, you go deep one place. Like you can't.
Do you know any like resources people could look towards for Chinese frescoes at all, or like anything like that? You could point people towards other folks.
I wish I could, but those books are stored at another place.
I'll recommend
You know what?
the Google.
I started to say the Google, but it's got me curious enough. Look at my website in the days to come, because because this usually inspires me to do something like this, because I go then looking it up myself, and then I use it as an excuse to like put recommended books on other fresco techniques. So keep an eye on my website over the next week or two. My hunch is this will inspire me to go, what are the good books about Chinese and Japanese and Korean and South American, and were there frescoes in Africa? Watch, I will end up putting together a list of books on my website.
Yeah.
It's usually I end up doing.
I've definitely seen some frescoes in Namibia that were like 40,000 years old. Those lasted a long time.
Oh, yeah. And there's cave paintings from Italy that are but I'm back to Italy because that's where my head is. Yeah. So what are you going to do?
Okay, last question. So you talked about all of the technique that went into moving David and how it was pretty particular to the material that the statue is made with. Did they solve those physics problems a different way with bronze statues, with things like non-marble statues?
Of moving them?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, every statue was a little bit different on physically moving it. Like everybody has a little bit of a different story. The David was the only one that I know of that was moved in that particular way. In fact, when it was moved out of its home in the late, after it was attacked, anyway, it's moved into the Academia. And by that time, they have track that they lay down. So it's not even moved that way the second time it's moved, when it leaves the city hall and moves into the museum that it lives in now. So every move of every colossal statue is extraordinarily different. And it always depends on the terrain, how far are they going, how paved are the streets, how narrow are the streets, what's it made of. David was a particular problem because, as I said, the Duccio stone, the stone that the David is made out of, this is another sort of scientific thing. It had been quarried about 50 years before Michelangelo got his hands on it. So it had been actually taken out of the earth and brought to Florence. And two other sculptors had gotten their hands on it, and they had cut into it, and they had sort of made gashes in it. So it has these big sort of gashes in the middle of it. It's a very sort of deformed stone. And it's been stored outside in the cathedral workshop for 50 years. So it's been battered by rain and snow and wind and weather. And marble becomes more brittle as it's left out of being quarried. Like you really want to quarry a piece of marble quickly after it's pulled out of the mountain because it's more supple and it just carves better. This is a really brittle stone to start with. And then Michelangelo has to actually model the David and create a composition for the David that would fit into the gashes that these other guys put in it, right? So that's why he was so concerned about it breaking, because the marble was already really brittle and it is already really narrow in unfortunate places. So that's why there was such care in doing it. When you move bronze, you don't have to be quite as careful that it's going to crack. Although then you have to start getting worried about heat and friction and things getting soft and bending. So you have different worries with moving colossal bronze statues than you do for marble. The other thing I'll say about moving David that lies in the same vein that I was going to talk about during the speech, and then I just didn't. Earthquakes, right? Italy, popular. If an earthquake struck Florence right now, we don't know if David would survive. There has been a law passed that he's supposed to be placed on a sort of an earthquakey platform that moves with him.
Isolated? Yeah.
So that he can sort of give like an earthquake would give. So hopefully his little tiny ankles won't shatter. He's not on that platform yet. So I keep like keeping an eye out for when he's on that platform, so I don't have to wake up in the middle of the night picturing him like, oh, it'd be so awful.
That would be very sad.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're really done with the questions.
Okay,
Thank you so much.
You did stump me. You got me on the Chinese frescoes. I don't know. Now I'm gonna have to go find out. So thanks.
I'm gonna check out your website to learn more. That's great. So we are out of time. I hope everybody enjoyed tonight's event. If you would like to watch this video again or share it with your friends, you can check out the video section on OMSI's Facebook page or on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter for updates on future events and more inspiring content from us, OMSI. And I know I mentioned it at the beginning, but please consider supporting Science Pub and making a donation via the Facebook donate button, or you can visit omsi.edu/donate. And please join us for our next Science Pub, July 14th, for a lecture by environmental scientist Dr. Sean Fleming, as he explores how math and physics can reveal the hidden secrets of rivers. He'll offer insights into the deep relationships rivers have with landscapes, ecosystems, and people, and we'll look at the threats our rivers face and how we can protect them over the long run. Once again, thanks to our partner Celestream for making tonight's event possible. And as always, you can get more information on all of the things on our website, omsi.edu. So thanks everyone and have a great night.